Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we have finally reached that point in the Yakuza series. After a long 10 games played and reviewed, it is finally time to cover the most widely beloved entry in the entire series, Yakuza 0. This, as the name implies, was a prequel to the original Yakuza set about 7 years before the opening portion of the first game, and 17 years before the majority of the original story. It's commonly recommended to newcomers as the game that they should start the series with, not only because of its prequel nature, but also because it's said to have some of the strongest writing and gameplay of the entire franchise, which makes it a consistent slam dunk for those who are just getting into the series for the first time. But this really made me wonder, is Yakuza 0 really that good, or is it just seen that way because it's where so many fans out there first experienced the traditional Yakuza formula? So I've finally gotten to the point where I was able to sit down and play 0 for the first time as someone who's been playing the Yakuza series in release order up to this point, and I definitely found some very interesting answers to that question. It's not exactly black and white either, so we have quite a bit to talk about actually. So, is Yakuza 0 really that good? Well, yes, but let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 11th in a series of videos where I'm playing every single game in the Yakuza series for the first time in release order and reviewing them as I go along. You don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, but I would definitely recommend watching my videos on the earlier titles if you want some better context on my feelings towards them. Plus, if you're a big fan of the Yakuza series, then you'll probably just enjoy them. So for those of you that might want to check those out, I'll have the full playlist in the description below. But for the rest of you, Yakuza 0 is an action-adventure game developed by Ryuga Gotoku Studio and published by Sega for the PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC in 2015. Like I mentioned just a minute ago, the game is a prequel to the original Yakuza on PS2, with the events of Yakuza 0 taking place in 1988, putting it 7 years before the opening chapter of Yakuza 1 in 1995. Because of this, we get to see a young, 20-year-old Kazuma Kiryu here, and this is a lot of fun. If you started the series with Yakuza 0, then you get to start your journey with Kiryu pretty much right when he first joined up with the Yakuza. But for fans who did play the first 5 numbered entries before this one, we get to see our experienced and damn near invincible main character at a time where he's essentially at the bottom of the food chain and barely even knows how to fight outside of just wildly throwing his weight around. It's just really good stuff whether you're a new fan or a returning one, and stuff like that always deserves a lot of praise. In the opening chapter of the game, Kiryu is framed for murder by some unknown party, seemingly in an attempt to drive his adoptive father figure Shintaro Kazuma out of the Dojima family. In order to clear his name, Kiryu ends up breaking his oath with the clan and leaving the family only a couple years after first joining, so that he can focus on finding out who framed him without being limited by the Yakuza's rules and code of honor. This provides a great setup for the story as a whole, and also allows for some great opportunities for drama between Kiryu and his former family, as him not being an official member anymore means there are no rules preventing either of them from going after each other now. And to my very pleasant surprise, Yakuza 0 actually has 2 protagonists that you play through throughout the game's run, with the second being my personal favorite character from the series, Goro Majima. When we meet Majima in Yakuza 0, he's laying low in Osaka after being expelled from the Tojo clan for going against his superiors after the betrayal of his sworn brother Taiga Saejima, all of which we saw during a flashback in Yakuza 4. The Tojo allowed him to live after that, but only under the condition that he would stay trapped in Sotenbori and manage a cabaret for a man named Tsukasa Sagawa, the sworn brother of Majima's former family patriarch. One day, though, Sagawa comes to Majima and tells him that if he can do one more job for him, he'll be allowed back into the Tojo clan. The catch, though? It's a hit job, and Majima's never actually killed anyone before. He's willing to do it though, but when he tracks down his target, it turns out to be a blind girl who seemingly has nothing to do with the Yakuza, or really any of the criminal underworld for that matter. So instead of killing her, Majima actually decides to protect her while trying to figure out why it is that the Yakuza want her dead. which of course leads to a lot of suspense and drama with him trying to convince the Yakuza that he's still searching for her, while also actively hiding her and throwing them off her trail. This makes Majima's story setup equally as compelling to Kiryu's, and while the two stories stay pretty separate while you bounce back and forth between them, they do of course end up coming together in the end and pitting the two of them against a common enemy. And much like everyone always told me, the story in Yakuza 0 is just really strong. It has one of the most compelling narratives out of the entire series so far, and definitely features some of the strongest writing as well. But that being said, after having experienced it, I'm so glad that I played the series in release order rather than chronological order. There are so many little references and callbacks to the first couple games here, as well as a bunch of cameo appearances from characters who go on to play vital roles in those later stories, but just have a tiny appearance in Yakuza 0. A lot of the big players from Yakuza 1 don't even appear in the main story here, and are instead found in some of the game's sub-stories. And if I wasn't already aware of who these people are and what they go on to do later in the story, they would have just felt like random side characters here, rather than feeling like an awesome opportunity to see them when they're younger and earlier on in their journey. And even for some of the Yakuza 1 characters who do play a vital role in the main story here, I still feel very similarly. Because even though they're more significant to Yakuza 0 itself, having played those PS2 games also really added a lot of weight to their roles in this story. And beyond all that, there are just those little details like the Yakuza 1 theme playing when Kiryu and Majima meet each other that really give a lot of fan service to fans who started with those originals, while not really offering much of anything to players who start here. That isn't to say that I think starting with 0 is a bad thing to do, because it really is perfectly fine if that's how you want to venture into the series, and there are benefits to playing in chronological order as well. I'm just saying that I'm personally very glad I went with release order in my journey, as it feels like Yakuza 0 was very much written for fans who had already played the originals. That being said though, the story of Yakuza 0 is one of those that's really hard to dig deeper into without massively spoiling a lot of it. So let's move on for now and come back to some more story stuff in the spoiler section. And as always, I feel like it's only right to talk a bit about the game's presentation before really getting into the gameplay. The graphics themselves haven't improved all that much from Ishin, which makes sense considering they're only a year apart and ran on the same systems. But the stylization of Yakuza 0 certainly does a lot of heavy lifting here and makes the game look a lot more appealing overall. For example, there's a new style of the text box scenes that we've seen 1,000 times from the series at this point, where they've made things much more visually interesting with actual camera work, and this odd yet weirdly appealing style where the characters aren't exactly moving, but they are still slightly animated when it comes to things like showing emotions through their face. They're still fully voice acted as well, so even though they might look weird in a video like this where you can't hear the audio, they kind of just work, and I actually enjoyed them a good bit. In terms of the world itself, the nighttime lighting in the cities has improved even more since the release of Yakuza 5 here, and it just looks fantastic. Crowds also look much more believable now, as they managed to work out the pop-in issues that the earlier titles had on PS3 when Ishin came out, but Ishin very rarely had the sort of dense crowds that you would see in the mainline games, so you couldn't really appreciate it much there. But here in 0, we finally get to see a densely populated Kamurocho or Sotenbori, with streets that are absolutely filled with NPCs just going about their day without any obvious pop-in. And that's about all I've got for the presentation. A few small improvements, but nothing super transformative compared to the last couple games. So now, let's get into the first real core pillar of any good Yakuza game, the combat. And I hope you've got a nice snack or a drink handy, because there's a lot to talk about with this, so we're gonna be here a while. Yakuza 0 has all of the foundational pieces of a great combat system. Things like the controls, the feel, the feedback, the lock-on system, all of it is just about perfect here. Well, aside from the lock-on system, which is still occasionally wonky, but it works like 90% of the time. There are also some new mechanics like counterattacks here, with players being able to press an attack button right as an enemy hits them to immediately break through the hit stun and strike back. which doesn't seem all that useful at first, but can be insanely helpful during things like boss fights or just fights against tougher enemies. And of course, they had to bring back the greatest strength of Ishin's combat, the style system. Both Kiru and Majima have been given 3 styles in this game that are completely unique to them, leading to a total of 6 fighting styles here in Yakuza 0. Much like in Ishin, each of these styles have a totally different feel from one another, as well as different strengths and weaknesses that make them worth using or avoiding in certain situations. To start, there's Kiryu's brawler style, which is essentially his basic combat style that we've seen in all of the mainline entries so far. You've got your basic combo strings, your grab attacks, the ability to perform heat actions on enemies who are on the ground. Everything that you've come to expect from Kiryu's kit is here. But what I really loved about this style is that even though a lot of his moveset from the other games is present here, the animations have been totally redone and slowed down considerably to make him feel less like an experienced fighter and more like a scrappy kid who's just throwing his weight around however he knows how to. It's essentially Kiryu's baseline as well, with it not really having any distinct strengths or weaknesses, and more just being his all-around style that will work in all situations, but rarely ever excel in any of them. After playing the game for a bit, Kiryu will also gain access to the Rush style. This is a boxing-themed style that deals much less damage than Brawler with each individual attack, but makes up for it with some incredible evasive properties and attacks that come out at near blinding speeds once you've completely filled up your heat gauge. This can be incredibly useful to avoid attacks during intense boss fights, but outside of that, I personally didn't end up using the Rush style all that much, other than just using it for fun. It's a very fun style, and one that I loved due to being a sucker for boxing styles in games like this, but definitely the style of Kiryu's that I felt had the least overall utility and practicality. Then there's Kiryu's third and final style, the Beast style. You'll earn this one very shortly after unlocking the Rush style, and even though it might seem a bit awkward at first, man can unleashing the Beast be absolutely overpowered when used correctly. This is a very slow and heavy feeling style that focuses on crowd control and turning Kiryu into a slow moving tank. It has decent enough combo strings, especially with the upgrades that make Kiryu hard to knock out of his attacks when in heat, but where the style really shines is in its use of weapons. Beast style allows you to grab weapons off the ground and immediately perform an attack with said item in the same animation, rather than needing to awkwardly pick up the weapon and wait for that animation to finish before actually using it. This is already useful enough, but the style also allows you to grab larger weapons that you wouldn't be able to lift otherwise, such as motorcycles, and start swinging them around too, making this the absolute best style to whip out if you see a large object nearby and have a crowd of enemies coming at you. It also has some great grab attacks, and the hyper armor that Kiryu gets in heat makes it easy to just absolutely bully the enemies in this game. Even the hardest bosses you'll encounter here will just get absolutely steamrolled by a fully upgraded Beast style user. Now, it's not all great, since the slow animations do make it very easy for enemies to actually get hits in on you while you're winding up your attacks, so if you're early in the game and don't have the upgrades or just don't have any heat built up even with the upgrades, you're going to get knocked around a bit yourself when using the Beast style. But use it in the right situations with the upgrades, and you're going to have an absolute blast just destroying entire groups of enemies in a single combo. So with all those styles at his disposal, Kiryu is a pretty well-rounded fighter. But if you ask me, he's got absolutely nothing on Majima in this game. Majima styles generally feel much more well-rounded than Kiryu's, with the first style available to him being the Thug style. This is essentially Majima's version of Kiryu's brawler style, with it being the blue-colored one that works in just about every situation without really excelling in any of them in particular. It's got good combo strings, good grab attacks, good heat actions for just about any situation you're in, and even some good counterattack options that can be unlocked through training with a master. I would go as far as to say that most of Majima's options in the Thug style are just slightly better versions of Kiryu's equivalents from the Brawler style, which already makes him a much more well-rounded fighter since his well-rounded style is just better. The second style that Majima will unlock is the Slugger style, and this one is just pure fun. The Slugger style makes use of a baseball bat with infinite durability, not just giving Majima access to the baseball bat weapon with no limits, but also adding a ton of new abilities and buffs to the bat that otherwise wouldn't be available if not using this style. For example, heavy baseball bat attacks will always bounce off of walls if you hit them during your animation and end up interrupting your attacks. But if you're using the Slugger style, you can earn an upgrade that stops this from happening just so long as you keep your heat gauge nearly full, which is obviously a huge bonus. There are of course other useful things like the ability to block attacks from all directions, new counterattack options, and a bunch of heat actions that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. But not bouncing off of the walls is easily the most transformative of the bunch. It's a really fun style that, similar to Kiryu's Beast style, really allows you to just plow through groups of enemies. It's not anywhere near as overpowered as the Beast style when upgraded, but it's still really solid and one that I found myself using quite a bit during Majima's half of the game. And the sixth and final style of the game is Majima's Breaker style. This is a breakdancing influenced style that sees Majima quickly attacking enemies with dance moves with incredible crowd control capabilities. And on top of the crowd control, some of the spins and such that he gains access to in this style are also just really good at dealing with tougher enemies and bosses, as the speed with which the kicks connect with the enemy allow you to break their guard and then immediately hit follow-ups on them before they can re-guard, making them amazing for enemies who tend to turtle up on you. It also has some really useful heat actions on offer, but even with everything it has going for it, I didn't find myself using this style very often. It has a bit of a weird flow to it with the combo strings and incorporating the dance moves into them and then deciding what to do with the poses that Majima strikes after said dance moves that, while certainly unique compared to really anything we've seen from the series so far, just felt a bit awkward to me and I never really got comfortable with them. It's not a bad style by any means. In fact, it's still a really strong one, just not one that I ended up enjoying all that much personally. And while I'm sure that someone has already gone down and commented about it, there are also two secret styles in the game, one for Kiryu and one for Majima, that are unlocked by completing some incredibly grindy side activities that we'll cover later on, but I didn't unlock either of these during my 70-hour playthrough of the game that I did for this video, which tells you how much of a grind it really is, so I just personally can't speak on them, so I'll mention that they're here and then just move on. So all of the styles are good in their own right, and I'm sure you could find people out there who would tell you that each of these 6 styles are their favorite. The way that they've been incorporated into the game is pretty great too, with little touches like the music changing depending on what style you're using, much like what we saw in Ishin. That being said though, where Ishin had slightly different compositions of the same tracks that would smoothly be transitioned into based on what style you whipped out, Zero just has one completely unique song for each style in the game that will abruptly start playing whenever you switch to that style. These tracks also only play while out in the open world or while doing side content, as all of the main story's combat tracks will play where they're supposed to and won't be influenced by your choice of combat style whatsoever. This is a really weird downgrade from what was one of the most subtle yet really cool things that Ishin did with this same system, but it's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. Just something that was very noticeable when playing Zero for the first time immediately after playing Ishin. That being said though, skill trees function very similarly to Ishin in this game as well, with there being one tree for each style in the game. But one simple change has turned these into some of my favorite skill trees in the entire series. Instead of gaining XP when fighting or completing sub-stories that then leads to you leveling up and earning a skill point that can be used to purchase new abilities, you now just use your money to buy new skills. And if you've watched my other videos on the Yakuza games, then you already know where I'm going and why I was so thrilled by this when I first saw it. I've been talking about money in nearly every single one of these videos for a while now, and how in a lot of the Yakuza games, money just ends up feeling completely pointless for the most part. Some of the games have done a good job of making it meaningful, particularly Kenzan and Ishin had some of the best approaches with this, with players being able to purchase and upgrade permanent weapons that would affect their damage output for the entire rest of the game. But using your money as a replacement for skill points is about as meaningful as they possibly could have made it within a mainline Yakuza title. This one simple change had me constantly keeping track of how much money I was making and spending throughout the game, which is exactly how you want a currency system to function in a large open-ended RPG like this. And it's a very natural change too, since they've also made it so that knocking enemies to the ground or hitting them with heat actions will cause money to literally come flying out of their pockets, which is then automatically added to your current pool of cash, effectively just turning the XP of the prior games into an extra source of cash flow here. Now, not everything about this change is great, but that's something that will be much easier to talk about during the open world section of the video. So for now, let's just keep rolling with the combat and come back to that idea in a little bit. One of the biggest changes that Zero introduces is a completely overhauled heat gauge. Instead of simply having one heat gauge that can be expanded during your playthrough, Zero now has a heat gauge that is split into 3 levels and cannot be expanded at all as you play. As you fill the gauge between these 3 levels, different passive buffs will be activated with each one, with some of these buffs being unique to what style you're using, but with one universal buff that affects everything from the moment you start up the game. That being that in Yakuza 0, how much heat you have built up will directly affect your attack speed. So when you have no heat, your attacks will come out pretty slow. When you have 1 full bar of heat, they'll speed up a little bit, and then at 2 full bars or more, they'll come out pretty fast. I did a little bit of looking around, and I found that some members of the community refer to this as the heat gear system, and I really like that name, so I'll probably be using it a bit throughout the video. But this is a change that I'm really not a fan of on multiple levels. The simplest reason that I dislike the heat gear system is that rather than feeling like you get faster with each bar of heat that you fill up, it instead feels like you just move slower anytime that you're below 2 full bars, as the maximum attack speed at 2 full bars or more is actually on par with the default attack speed of things like Kiryu's brawler combos in the prior games. So instead of feeling like you're being rewarded for filling up your heat gauge and becoming more powerful with it, it feels like you're just constantly being punished for not maintaining maximum heat at all times. Additionally, the fact that the heat gauge starts at this size and can't be expanded through leveling up or any of the side content just means that one of the most rewarding aspects of the progression in the earlier titles has been taken away here. I always loved how in the older games you would start out only being able to do 1 heat action at a time, since that one would just drain all of your heat that you have by default, but then you get to slowly build up your heat gauge throughout your playthrough to be able to chain together multiple heat actions and really dish out the pain once you're leveled up. Here though, you just start with what feels like it's honestly too much heat for the very start of the game, and end with a heat gauge that's a lot smaller than it would be by the end of the prior titles. On a more positive note though, Yakuza 0 has some awesome boss fights. The team at RGG was really starting to nail the boss fights down by this point in the series, and Yakuza 0 is no exception. Not all of them are fantastic, and there are still some that I really didn't have much fun fighting against, but most of them are great, and Kiryu's final boss in the story might actually be a contender for the most fun boss in the entire series for me so far. Though it is still hard to beat Aizawa's fight from Yakuza 5. But as great as the bosses in this game are, an area where Yakuza 0 weirdly takes a step back from its predecessor is the standard enemies. This is because Yakuza 0 takes its enemy AI behavior straight from Ishin, much like Yakuza 3 took its AI behavior from Kenzan. This is perfectly fine, as Ishin's enemy AI was pretty spot on and I never had any issues with it there. But the issue here is that Ishin's AI wasn't designed around the heat gear mechanic, which put more simply means that Ishin's enemy AI is great, but it starts to feel a lot more annoying when your attacks are being slowed down from their standard speed just because you don't have a full heat gauge. When your attacks are slowed down like this, it can sometimes be hard to actually get hits in on enemies without them just hitting you first and knocking you out of them. And this can be made even more annoying by the fact that the enemies don't wait and take turns in Ishin or Zero, so you will likely have a lot of moments where you get interrupted during your attacks, and then stun-locked into taking some pretty major damage from multiple enemies at once. Maybe you could argue that this is the whole point of the heat gear system, but even so, I just didn't find it very fun, and it was probably the most frustrating aspect of Yakuza 0's combat for me. So overall, I really do love a lot of Yakuza 0's combat, and would love to tell you that it's among the best of the series so far, but for every piece of the combat design that I like, there's something that I dislike just as much. So while the combat was still a lot of fun, it definitely felt like a noticeable step down to me after just coming off of experiences like Yakuza 5 and Ishin. But where I felt Yakuza 0 shone more than anywhere else is in the open world and the side content, which is a really good thing because, as I've said many times before, this is what I personally feel is the most important aspect for a Yakuza game to really nail. To start, this is the most drastically different Kamurocho that we've seen from the series yet. This classic setting for the series changes to some degree with just about every single entry, but Yakuza 0's Kamurocho is just so full of changes both in its visual styling and its layout that it makes it feel more unique than any other appearance of the iconic Red Light District that we've seen so far. The same can't exactly be said about Sotenbori in this game, as it largely just feels the same as when we last saw it in Yakuza 5, but there are definitely some subtle differences there as well. They're just nowhere near as significant as those seen in Kamurocho. This means that, at least for Kiryu's half of the game, Yakuza 0 feels like it has one of the most distinctly unique open world maps from the mainline series so far, which is a great start to making a memorable open world experience for the players. These districts are also packed with minigames much like usual, with a staggering 23 unique minigames on offer here. A lot of the classics that you'd expect to see are of course here, with things like the batting cages, which have been in every single mainline entry since the PS2 original, still being there. But there are also a ton of new standout additions on offer. These can be as simple as a classic 80s arcade game from Sega, or as complex as a telephone club game where Kiryu has to flirt with women anonymously over the phone in an attempt to convince them to meet up with him in person. And then, if you do convince them to meet up with you, every single one of the 9 women that you can possibly speak to here has a unique sub-story tied to your in-person meeting with them. And of course, it wouldn't feel like a game truly set in the 80s without an awesome disco minigame. And this was a personal favorite of mine, as it feels like they took the dance battle mechanics from Haruka's portion of Yakuza 5 and improved on them significantly just to let you go and dance to a bunch of bangers that the sound team cooked up, with each song aiming to replicate popular music styles from the 80s such as Eurobeat, or even iconic artists such as Michael Jackson or David Bowie. I'm pretty sure I spent more time playing minigames here than in any other Yakuza playthrough I've done so far, and with a minigame roster like this, is it really any wonder why? I also spent a ton of time during my playthrough engaging with Yakuza 0's sub-stories, because they were just so damn good here. There are an even 100 sub-stories in Yakuza 0, with 60 of them being available to Kiryu and 40 of them being available to Majima. And I say this with no exaggeration, I enjoyed every single one of them that I came across. They were all so wacky, well-written, and wildly entertaining that I was never bored during any of the game's sub-stories, which is pretty impressive for small side missions with no voice acting and minimal animation work. There's even a whole chain of sub-stories here that involves Kiryu writing letters to his favorite radio show about the other sub-stories that you've done in the hopes that the host of the show will read them out loud on air. It may not be the largest roster of sub-stories that we've seen in a single Yakuza game, but they're all just really fun and super varied, so I'm definitely a huge fan of Zero's sub-stories. A lot of the stronger open world systems from Ishin have also been brought to the mainline series here, with the biggest of these being the Diligence system, or as Yakuza 0 has renamed it to, the Completion Point system. This system is basically unchanged here aside from the name, with players still earning these completion points for doing just about any of the side content available in the game, and then being able to exchange those points at a shrine for things like being able to dash longer, making enemies drop more cash during combat, and other such upgrades that will have a pretty major effect on the rest of your playthrough. Bringing the system back in a game with such high quality side content leads to an even better result than what we saw with Ishin, and I absolutely loved being rewarded for going out of my way to do all of the already fun stuff that RGG packed into the game. I mean, I would have done it anyway even without this system, but it's nice to get extra bonus rewards on top of it. And speaking of things that are improved from Ishin, the training is a lot better here than it was in the previous game. If you haven't seen my video on the original Ishin, I was super frustrated by how much work the game would make the player do to even open up new training lessons to begin with, only for the game to then take that new technique away from you as soon as you mastered it within the lesson, and make you work your way potentially to the very end of a style's skill tree to unlock it again. It was just way grindier than that system ever needed to be, and to call that section of my Ishin video a small rant would be an understatement. Here in Zero, though, it's been adjusted to be a lot less frustrating. You'll still have to get to the point in the skill tree that training skill is at to unlock it, but instead of doing so after you've already done the training, reaching this point in the tree is now the prerequisite to actually being taught that skill. This means that instead of learning a skill only for it to be locked again and requiring a hefty grind to earn back, you do the grind beforehand and then just keep the skill after the lesson. You don't even have to spend the money on that node anymore. As soon as you complete the training, that skill is yours to keep, exactly how it used to be and exactly how it should be. This is way better in terms of feel, despite not really being that different. And it also helps a lot that all of the training skills in this game have been placed in the early to middle sections of the tree, rather than a bunch of them being locked at the very end of them. And before getting into all the crazy new stuff that Yakuza 0's open world brings to the table, I know we haven't even gotten to the new stuff yet, we have one more point to cover that is probably the single biggest make or break when it comes to a Yakuza game's pacing: the dreaded random encounter rate. And I have to report that Yakuza 0's random encounter rate is actually just about perfect. You aren't being bombarded with random encounters constantly, but they also aren't so sparse to the point where you can't use them to farm money or items when you want to. On top of that, they're pretty easy to run away from thanks to Yakuza 0 bringing over Ishin's dashing mechanic, and they've even added a whole new mechanic where you can throw a wad of cash out on the street to distract the enemies before they even jump you, to quite literally buy back some of your time. So not only is the encounter rate great, but they've also made it easier than ever to simply opt out of these encounters if you don't want them, meaning the amount of random encounters that you get into in Yakuza 0 is completely up to you. But that just about covers all of the traditional Yakuza open world content, so now let's get into Zero's numerous additions to the formula. The simplest of the bunch, yet probably my favorite, is the addition of Mr. Shakedown. Mr. Shakedown isn't actually one individual, rather it's a series of these huge dudes who strut around town looking to beat you up and steal all the money you're carrying on your person. These fights are incredibly difficult, and if you aren't already fairly upgraded and very comfortable with the game's combat, you're pretty much guaranteed to lose. And when I say steal all the money you're carrying, that's not an exaggeration at all. They will literally leave you with 0 yen if you lose the fight. This isn't a feature that purely punishes you though, as Mr. Shakedown will actually walk around with a massive pool of cash in his pockets as well. And if he does end up beating you and taking all of your money, it will simply be added to his existing pool instead of just disappearing into the void. This means that if you can beat him, you can not only get a huge chunk of change in return for that victory, but you can also win back all of the money that you lost in your previous attempts. This makes the Mr. Shakedown fights a huge risk-reward mechanic, as you're essentially betting all of your money on whether or not you can win the millions or even billions of yen that Mr. Shakedown is carrying when he appears. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm personally a huge sucker for a good risk-reward mechanic in video games, so I absolutely adored learning how to beat Mr. Shakedown and start to farm him for massive amounts of money after having lost so much cash to him early in the game. It's an awesome feeling once you manage to get there, and I would love to see something like this continue to appear in future entries. Then there's the addition of the new weapons shop, the Dragon and Tiger. This is a shop that Majima will gain access to during his very first story chapter, and it is easily the most complex weapons shop that we've seen from the franchise so far. At a basic level, it's very similar to the weapons shops that we've seen from the earlier games, with players being able to purchase some new weapons and equipment for cash, or even craft new weapons and equipment for both cash and raw materials that can be found out in the world. But the big difference here is how you acquire those raw materials. In Yakuza 0, Majima won't simply find these materials lying around. Instead, he'll have to actually send agents out into the field to scavenge them from all over the globe. And this gets complicated very quickly, with you being able to choose which agent you're going to send where, with each continent having a ton of different areas to scout out that each offer their own rewards at different drop rates. The agent that you send there will also have an effect on both the drop rates of the items that can be found there, but also the guaranteed items that you'll receive regardless of the success of the mission. And yes, how successful a mission is does affect how much you earn for it, as sometimes you'll send an agent out and have them come back with far more than expected, and sometimes they'll come back with nothing more than the basic guaranteed items. And of course, these expeditions will cost you a bit of capital, so you'll have to pay certain amounts of yen based on both the agent that you send out as well as where they're traveling to. You can also add a tip to your agent on top of the required costs to raise the success rate, but I never found this to be very necessary, so I largely ignored it. That being said though, I've never really used weapons all that much in these mainline Yakuza titles, so I didn't really make too much use of or dig too deep into the Dragon and Tiger during my playthrough. I do still think that it's really cool though, and if you're a big fan of using weapons in these games, this is probably a really fun and rewarding way to earn yourself some higher grade equipment. And while it might seem like a huge money sink, Yakuza 0 thankfully adds a couple of new ways to easily make lots of money. These come in the form of new businesses that the player can manage, with both Kiru and Majima being given their own respective business to build up and maintain. These businesses also function very similarly to the side stories that we saw in Yakuza 5 and Ishin, with the storyline progressing as you hit certain milestones in building them up. Roughly halfway into the game, Kiru is given access to a real estate business, which opens up his business side story, Real Estate Royale. This business involves managing the one property that you're given to start with to bring in some income, and said income is just passively generated over time while you're out in the open world doing whatever it is you might be doing. By coming back to the office, you're able to collect the revenue generated by this property, which you can then use to either upgrade it or to go out to other local businesses around Kamurocho and purchase them, adding them to your portfolio as additional revenue streams. This obviously snowballs more and more as you continue to manage it, as adding more properties and upgrading the ones that you already own will, of course, generate more income in the same amount of time, which then allows you to go out and buy and upgrade even more properties. There's a whole side story here involving Kiryu challenging the 5 billionaires who secretly own Kamurocho and run it from the shadows, but let's be honest, that's not the real reason you engage with this system. You're here to invest Kiryu's money and turn it into even more money, and when it comes to making money, there's nothing else in the entire Yakuza franchise that will generate as much revenue as Real Estate Royale, and the fact that it generates that revenue passively while you're out doing other things only makes it that much better. It's an awesome piece of side content, an outstanding way of making money while playing as Kiryu, and I personally had a ton of fun building up this business on the side throughout my playthrough. Majima's side hustle in this game is called Cabaret Club Zar, which, as you might have guessed, involves him building up and managing his own cabaret club. You'll start out with a new club and only 3 hostesses on staff, but as you open up for business, people will slowly trickle in, and the more people that have a good time in your club, the more the word spreads, and the more people that will come in the next time you open. Majima is able to hire new hostesses either by just meeting women out on the streets of Sotenbori and convincing them to join up, or by spending some of your completion points at a shrine and quite literally summoning a new star hostess out of thin air. You're then able to dress these hostesses up to maximize certain stats of theirs like we've seen in previous titles with hostess minigames, and Majima can even do special one-on-one training with them to raise their stats even further and make them better at working with your customers. Much like Kiryu's business, Majima is able to make a lot of money through this cabaret club, but there is a really big difference in that Kiryu's business is totally passive aside from the collection and acquisition, while Majima's business is totally active. None of this cabaret club stuff runs in the background while you go around and do other things. You have to be there, managing the floor during shifts, taking time to meet with your hostesses, going out and finding new hostesses or business partnerships, all sorts of stuff. On top of that, Majima's business just generates significantly less revenue than Kiryu's does, so you're putting in like 5 times the effort for less than half of the profit. I did still really enjoy Majima's side business, but compared to Kiryu's, it's hard not to be a bit disappointed by its potential, even though the minigame you play while managing the floor is admittedly pretty fun. But as great as these businesses are, they are also the largest contributors to one of my bigger issues with Yakuza 0. That being that this game's economy is frankly just an absolute shit show. These businesses can be built up to the point of bringing in hundreds of millions of yen within literal minutes, and while that at least takes some effort to grind out and build up, the economy in Yakuza 0 is completely shot within about 15 minutes of first starting the game. This is because even when you're just fighting enemies out on the streets, you are making ludicrous amounts of money in this game. Here's a clip of the first time I ever knocked an enemy down in the entire game. Literally the combat tutorial that I ran into 12 minutes after selecting New Game on the main menu. Now, pay attention to the fact that Kiryu starts the game with an even 30,000 yen in his pocket, but after knocking down this first enemy in the tutorial, I jump up to 79,823 yen. This means that in a single combo, I generated just shy of 50,000 yen, nearly tripling the amount of money that I started the game with. And by the end of this first tutorial fight, I had earned over 123,000 yen in total from just this fight alone, which is insane, as this is the least money that you will ever make from a single fight in the entire game. This is obviously because with the skill tree now using yen as its unlock criteria, you get prices all the way up to 1 billion yen for a single skill. And that's fine, but the issue is that the entire rest of the game's economy has not been adjusted for this. So when I go to the store and buy a healing item for just a few hundred yen, or go to the disco and need to pay the 2,000 yen entry fee, none of these things feel like they actually matter, because I practically have infinite money from the moment the game starts, and the only thing that I feel like I have to be mindful about my spending with is the skill tree. Anything else in the game, I just have fuck you money. This is admittedly not a major complaint considering how good everything else in the game is, but I do think it's worth pointing out that in the game where money should be more meaningful than any other title in the franchise, it somehow becomes the least meaningful that it ever has been. Overall though, the open world and side content offering was genuinely outstanding in Yakuza 0, and it's probably the greatest strength of the game if you ask me. The only reason that my playthrough of 0 was as incredibly long as it was because I just kept doing the side content without even really thinking about it, because I was just having so much fun doing it. I eventually had to force myself to stop engaging with the side content and just finish the rest of the story so that this video could get done in a somewhat reasonable amount of time. Otherwise, I probably would have totally maxed out the businesses, done more side stories, played more mini games, and just so much more stuff than I actually did. So if you're the kind of player who loves to just get lost in all the content a game has to offer, Yakuza 0 will likely keep you hooked for a long time. But before wrapping up the video, I did want to circle around and talk a little more in depth on the story. I will be spoiling things a good bit here, and generally just talking as if I'm assuming you've played the game before, so if you haven't played Yakuza 0 for yourself yet and you want to avoid those spoilers, skip to the timestamp on screen and join us again when we're done. Okay, so I'm going to start with what will probably be my hottest take in the video, but I don't really feel like Yakuza 0 does a whole lot as a prequel. Typically, prequels like this exist to further flesh out the backstories of the characters or the history of the world of these long-running series. And while Zero definitely does some of that, it felt like it did very little for someone like me who played 1 through 5 first. Kiryu feels pretty much exactly like he does in the later games here. He's a bit more of a loose cannon, sure, like he definitely does run into bad situations a little quicker, but he does plenty of that later on as well, and his personality and core values feel identical aside from that. I was expecting to see a younger Kiryu develop those virtues that I've come to know him for over the course of the game, but I just didn't really get that. It felt like Kiryu, even at 20 years old and the start of his story, just kind of already had things figured out for the most part. The game also has a running bit where they talk about how Kiryu is becoming a Yakuza for the first time here, but I didn't get that either. Kuze makes it out to mean that Kiryu is tough enough and brave enough to fight for what he believes in rather than just doing what he's told. But like, the game literally opens with Kiryu doing exactly that, and beating Kuze's ass while doing so I'm not really sure exactly what he means by this. I was also hoping to see some further fleshing out of Nishikiyama's character, as he was a great villain in Yakuza 1, but the one major issue that I had with him there was that he got very little screen time in the one game he appeared in before dying. And we do get to see more of Nishki in this game, but we don't really learn anything about him that we didn't already know from Yakuza 1. He's Kiryu's best friend since childhood from the orphanage, who became his sworn brother when they joined the Dojima family together, and even though he likes to give off the image of being better than Kiryu, he's secretly very jealous of him and looks up to him a lot more than he wants anyone to believe. This is all good stuff, but it's all stuff that we knew already. We also know from Yakuza 1 that alongside Kiryu going to jail, his sister getting sick and dying was the start of his descent into becoming a villain. So you'd hope that in a prequel you get to learn a little more about that as well, but in this game, we don't learn more about his sister at all either. There's literally one mention of her in the entire game where Nishikiyama basically just goes, "Oh yeah, I have a sister too," and that's it. I was honestly more disappointed with Nishki's character in this game than any other, just because there was so much with this character that could have been built on or fleshed out further. But all they really did was just reiterate everything we already knew about him from Yakuza 1. And once again, he didn't really get a lot of screen time in this game. It was definitely more screen time than in Yakuza 1, but he never spends any of that time doing anything other than just being Kiryu's best friend, so it felt very wasted to me. On the other hand though, the character work that they do with Majima in this game is incredible, and for me at least, completely overshadows anything that they're doing with Kiryu or Nishiki here. Unlike those two, Majima feels like a totally different person here than what we saw in Yakuza 1 and onwards. And on top of that, we actually get to see what it was that caused such a drastic personality shift for him happen on screen during the events of this game. His whole character arc in this game of not being able to kill a single person in the beginning, even though literally his whole life depends on it, to eventually being threatened with the loss of someone he truly cares about, which pushes him to the point of being willing to do anything, even killing others, is so well done. Additionally, the couple scenes that we get with him at the end of the game are legitimately heartbreaking. He realizes after losing the woman he loves that the only reason he lost her in the first place was because he let everyone around him play him like a clown. So as a result, he decided to start living life however he wanted and playing that role of the clown to an extreme, making him impossible to control and giving birth to the unpredictable and unhinged Majima that we've come to know through the rest of the mainline series. And of course, the final scene between him and Makoto where he intentionally doesn't speak a word in front of her to not give away who he is and risk hurting her even further, and then he makes sure that there will be someone else there for her to take care of her in his absence, it legitimately had me on the verge of tears. It's wild to me that they do so much in terms of fleshing out Majima while doing so little with the other characters in the game. But hey, Majima's always been my favorite character in the series ever since playing the PS2 original, so I'm not exactly complaining that he's the one who got all the love here. And while most of the new cast members are plenty enjoyable, there is one particular group of newcomers that I feel like I have to mention for a video like this to be complete. Daisaku Kuze, Hiroki Awano, and Keiji Shibusawa, the 3 lieutenants of the Dojima family. These 3 act as the primary antagonists of Kiryu's half of the story, and each and every one of them is nothing short of phenomenal, from their key personality traits to their dialogue and writing to their actors' performances. Kuze is the first one that you'll really get to clash with here, with your first boss fight against him acting as the finale to the opening story chapter. I say first because Kuze acts as a recurring boss in this game, popping up for a rematch once every few chapters. He's your more blunt and straightforward Yakuza, completely unafraid to let others know where he stands, and ruthlessly violent towards anyone who gets in his way. Awano acts as Kiryu's primary antagonist specifically during the second act of the game, and he's one of the more interesting villains the series has produced so far in my opinion. He's Dojima's extortion expert, but curiously, he doesn't really care much for his career as a Yakuza. He explains to Kiryu that he enjoyed the fighting and the other Yakuza activities when he was younger, but nowadays, he just does what Dojima asks him so that he can use his position to live a life of leisure full of money, women, and whatever else he could really want. He's also the only Dojima lieutenant that Kiryu won't actually fight at any point in the story, as they clash with their ideals rather than their fists. Majima does get to fight him during the finale though, which is a bit weird because even though he is an antagonist for a lot of the game, I feel like it would have been very fitting to have him just not have a boss fight and be purely an idealistic antagonist, but it is what it is. And last but certainly not least, we have Shibusawa. Shibusawa is Dojima's money guy, overseeing the funding and the business side of the Dojima family. This makes him seem like the least threatening of the 3, but when he comes into play during the game's third and final act, players will quickly learn that that couldn't be further from the truth. Not only is Shibusawa incredibly intelligent, but he's also incredibly cold and manipulative, seemingly having no empathy for others and a very strong superiority complex. He will do absolutely anything to get results and have no issue with how far he has to go to achieve them, with the worst part being that he's more than smart enough to figure out just how to do that. He actually reminds me a lot of Yakuza 3's Yoshitaka Mine in that sense, which was also one of my favorite antagonists from the series, so I guess that tells you something. I've got a type. He's easily the most entertaining of the 3 lieutenants for me, just because of how easy it is to underestimate him, only for him to be an absolute demon once he comes into play. He also acts as Kiryu's final boss, and like I said earlier, is easily in my top 3 final bosses of the series, and could definitely be a contender for the first or second spots, but it's just really hard to choose a favorite out of Aizawa, Hanpeta, and Shibusawa. They're all just goated fights. But in the interest of wrapping things up, I really did love my first playthrough of Yakuza 0. The main story was one of the strongest from the series so far, the combat, while not quite as good as the last couple games, was really solid, and the side content had me getting lost in the open world for hours at a time. There were certainly some aspects of the game that I felt didn't quite live up to the earlier Yakuza titles, and some disappointments with the game as a prequel as well, but in my opinion, the positives massively outweigh the negatives with this one. I can absolutely see why this is the favorite of most Yakuza fans out there, especially if this game also happened to be your first exposure to the general Yakuza formula. And while I personally still enjoyed games like Kurohyou and Yakuza 5 just a little bit more, 0 definitely isn't far behind. I mean, you play as Majima for half of the game, so regardless of how good the game actually was, of course it was going to end up near the top of my favorites list. Do I think it's a flawless masterpiece that RGG could never hope to top? No, I definitely don't. But do I think that it's easily one of the best games that they've produced so far, and one that I will likely still be talking about in high regard for years to come? Yeah, absolutely. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Yakuza 0 an 8.7 out of 10. Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end of this very long video. I'm assuming if you made it all the way here, you probably enjoyed the video, and if you did, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a sub, just anything to help me out with the algorithm a bit. It really helps a lot, and I appreciate it a ton. And if you really enjoyed what you saw and you didn't already know about it, I do have channel memberships and a Patreon where you can support the channel even further while getting things like early video access, behind the scenes updates, and a whole lot more. So if that interests you at all, feel free to check those out. With all that being said though, I'm going to try to not take up any more of your guys' time, so thank you once again for watching, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Yakuza review.